Welcome to Session 8 of Sea Power 19, and this session's entitled The Indo-Pacific in the Next 5 Years. It's certainly my great pleasure to introduce the chair for this morning's session, Vice Admiral David Shackleton, AO, REN, retired, to introduce the panel. Sir.
Jonathan, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me at the back? Thank you. It's difficult with these lights. I can't tell if you're awake or not. So if you're sitting next to somebody who goes to sleep, can you give them a bit of a nudge and tell them to stop snoring, please? It's my pleasure to be your host for this final panel session today on the Indo-Pacific region, in which we're going to focus on its importance over the next 5 years. This is no small task, given the importance of this region to all that are here today, and especially Australia. We'll shortly hear from our first speaker, Dr. Euan, who's going to be followed by Professor Paul Dibb, Professor Byrne, Dr. Beck Strating, Dr. Andrew Carr, and Professor Stephan Frühling. From their biographies, which you can find in the various apps and the conference documentation, you can see that these people are, frankly, a veritable who's who of expert practitioners in this field. I'm not going to read their bios, but please, I do ask you to do so because you'll be impressed by what their backgrounds are. They spent years absorbing themselves in Australia's national security affairs and its interests, and I have no doubt, personally, that you're going to find their remarks incisive, highly pertinent to the geostrategic circumstances we can see unfolding in the region in which we all live, which is kind of different to a lot of our history. And perhaps they might venture to be controversial in their proposition of what's necessary for Australia to navigate the rocks and shoals that do lie ahead on the passage plan as Australia transits towards its future. Would you please join me in welcoming our panel? Before I hand over to Dr. Graham, I'd just like to give some introductory remarks, if I may, which hopefully will stimulate some of your curiosity. 5 years is not a long time in the overall scheme of things, whereas we know some cultures measure progress in centuries. But just about everything in the Indo-Pacific is a challenge. It's a challenge to make sense of on a day-to-day basis, never mind 5 years away. One can already sense that disruption is occurring and the change is already present. There are questions about whether a rules-based international order is already fraying at the edges. What does all this mean for Australia and especially its Navy? This audience doesn't need reminding that we're living in the so-called Asian century. After having now gone through 20 years of what this century is, perhaps we might now assess that this slogan has missed its mark and it should instead be called the Indo-Pacific century. In a speech to a naval audience in September 2018, about a year ago, Dr. Graham explored some aspects of today's topic. And what might be a taste of what is to come, he had these insightful and somewhat unsettling words to say, and I quote, "Geopolitical forces are fracturing our region. It is not clear if the old order can evolve to accommodate the new strategic realities or what might replace it. We cannot assume there will be a single order in future. With the diffusion of power, a macro region as diverse as the Indo-Pacific could fracture into multiple orders. That does not have to break the peace, but it will make the tasks of multinational maritime security cooperation more complicated. Transnational maritime security challenges are no respecters of imaginary fence posts in the sea." Thank you, Euan.
Thank you very much, Admiral Shackleton, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'd also like to thank the Royal Australian Navy for the chance to speak to you for a second chance from this podium. Strategists focus on interstate competition, strategic rivalry, including reactive arms dynamics, and nationalism as major disruptors of stability. And the Indo-Pacific macro region is rich in all of these categories. Disruption can also be delivered more benignly via technological change, and we've already had substantial discussion on that yesterday, including new patterns in energy supply and consumption and other factors that bear on transnational manufacturing and supply chains, like 3D printing. But today I'm going to focus on strategic disruption risks and set some broad context to the Indo-Pacific region. Strategic linkages between the various sub-regions, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, Australasia, and the South Pacific are undoubtedly growing. And the revival of the quadrilateral that we heard about from David Brewster yesterday, however low-key, I think demonstrates that linkage. But treating the Indo-Pacific as a single strategic canvas is literally and figuratively a stretch. As a maritime person, the Indo-Pacific concept has always had an instinctive appeal. And before I moved from Singapore to Australia 5 years ago, I renamed the course that I was teaching in Singapore from Asia to Indo-Pacific to try and communicate the significance of a maritime continuum via Asia's long littoral. As Dr. Brewster also said yesterday from this podium, it makes sense to view the long littoral as a single strategic entity if you are Singapore or Australia. Eurasia's indented southern littoral, shaped by its recurring pattern of basins, peninsulas, and fringing archipelagos, has long served as a geoeconomic entity and also as a cultural connector, stretching into antiquity. And I'll give a plug here for a book that I read recently by Philip Bowring called Empire of the Winds, which comments on a not an often enough explored area of history, really the role of Indonesia in formulating that, what he calls Nusantara, but their role as the brokers of shipping networks and trade networks. That unexplored history, I think, is something that's overdue for revival. Rear Admiral Srikanda on the panel yesterday was also wise to warn us that the land dimension is central to any concept of the Indo-Pacific, even a concept as amorphous as Belt and Road. But the Indo-Pacific's long littoral is also given physical expression at sea via the shipping conveyor belt that runs eastwards, composed of tankers that sail through the Strait of Hormuz, delivering energy to India, Singapore, Shanghai, Seoul, and Tokyo. And in the westwards direction, container ships carry manufactured goods from Northeast Asia to Europe. Now, it may be that the economic importance of this maritime conveyor belt has already peaked, but I think it will still be a defining feature of the Indo-Pacific in 5 years' time, and I dare say making increased demands on regional navies to provide maritime security for the ever more marginalised mariner community. It also makes sense to view Asia's long littoral in geopolitical terms. And the geostrategist Nicholas Speakman, who was also referenced by the Admiral yesterday, was among the first to properly articulate this via his concept of the rimland as a vital determinant of global power balances, one that straddles both the continental and the maritime metrics of power. What Speakman observed in the 1930s and 1940s remains true now, because the long littoral is where so much of the world's population and productive capacity is concentrated. And I don't want to belabor a dry definitional debate over the Indo-Pacific because, as Admiral Shackleton gave our riding instructions this morning, we're expressly charged with looking forward at risks in the 5-year period ahead. But except to note that the recent gains that the Indo-Pacific has made as a framing concept recently adopted by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations after some prevarication, India and Indonesia, as well as the more established users, Australia, Japan, Taiwan, and the United States. However, the Indo-Pacific is still not uniformly accepted, and it stands on less firm ground, at least in terms of official nomenclature, in New Zealand, South Korea, and even Singapore. Now, of these countries, New Zealand's ambivalence towards the concept and lingering preference for Asia-Pacific is perhaps the easiest to understand, just as a function of geography. They have no Indo frontage. But when it comes to energy supply, of course, both Australia and New Zealand remain critically reliant on seaborne supplies for both refined and unrefined energy. And that reaches back to the Middle East via East and Southeast Asia. Although it's also worth pointing out that New Zealand does rather better than Australia on petroleum reserves. So, having laid the context, what about the risks? Well, strategic risks along the long littoral are not evenly dispersed. In broad terms, the incidence of armed conflicts is highest in the Middle East, and it declines the further east one proceeds. That may sound odd, given the presence of so much tension and military capability in Northeast Asia, but in terms of actual conflicts, that has been the prevailing pattern for decades. And in South Asia, we recently had another illustration of armed conflict that did manifest. But in Southeast Asia, the pattern for many decades has tended to be more of internal conflict. And then in Northeast Asia, the paradox is that East Asia, while it has had prolonged absence of war between states, experiences the most tangible tension. And I'd also make the observation that the transmission of instability of wars and flashpoints in the Middle East and South Asia tends to be limited to non-state domains like terrorism. In very broad terms, strategy more easily, I think, flows west rather than east. Despite some serious ceasefire breakdowns and exchanges of fire between North and South Korea, East Asia, and when I say East Asia, I'm talking collectively about Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, has experienced no significant state-on-state armed conflict in over 3 decades. America's armed forces have not engaged in a single combat operation in the Indo-Pacific Command area of responsibility in well over 40 years. This stark fact receives too little attention, in my view. It suggests, on one hand, that deterrence has worked well in East Asia, enabling its runaway economic success to take hold. But it could also be that the threshold for the US to use force is simply higher in East Asia than elsewhere. And I think we see that in regard to North Korea and also to the various maritime disputes and grey zone scenarios in which China is involved, from the South China Sea to the East China Sea. The United States has trod very carefully in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia since the end of the Vietnam War, but also throughout the so-called unipolar moment. I think such risk aversion is important to understanding the peculiar attention that freedom of navigation operations have received in a US-China context more recently. And back to that paradox, the paradox of East Asia, on the one hand, being a runaway economic success, but yet palpably not a region at peace. Nationalism and strategic rivalry spills over into the maritime domain in the form of island territorial disputes and military modernization, perhaps not an arms race, but certainly a competitive dynamic, with a distinctly early 20th century feel. Now, the Australian National University's Professor Brendan Taylor has identified 4 flashpoints in the region: the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the East China Sea. The South China Sea and the East China Sea scenarios are probably more easily contained, given that the large human populations are not directly involved in these disputed territories. But elsewhere, maritime tensions between Vietnam and China have been running high again this year, and China-Japan altercations over the Senkaku-Diaoyu Island dispute continue, despite a recent mending of political fences in the China-Japan relationship. Japan-Korea political frictions have unfortunately reached such an intensity that this has spilled over even into the military domain. This latter tension point still has strategic effects, imposing strains on an already stressed US alliance system, even though the risk of Japan and Korea trading actual blows is minimal. Much less predictable has been the emergence of Hong Kong as a rather different kind of flashpoint or rolling crisis in the region. Politicians and professional militaries have to readjust their lens to allow for a concept of peace that also embodies intense strategic competition between states. One, however, that is below the threshold of combat operations. Warfare is being actively prosecuted by authoritarian states through hybrid or other means. This, and the absence of combat, particularly in the East Asian region, is, I think, again, paradoxically integral to a peculiar tense strategic dynamic. And it's one that I think has enabled the default hedging behavior that characterizes how regional states are positioning themselves vis-à-vis an increasingly fraught US-China great power dynamic. It may be that it will take a full-blown security crisis, not a mock crisis like the North Korean situation in 2017, but a real crisis for the future regional security dynamic to properly take shape. That's not to say that such a crisis is preordained, still less that it's desirable, but simply I just think that it's more likely that we're going to face such a moment in East Asia that threatens to break that long peace that stretches back over 4 decades in the most Pacific part of the long littoral. If not in 5 years, then within 10. And I think of those major regional flashpoints identified by Professor Taylor, Taiwan, for my money, is the one to watch, depending in part on the outcome of next January's presidential elections. But also, bearing significantly on strategic risk in the Indo-Pacific in the next 5 years, is the outcome of elections in that most far-flung eastern outpost of the Indo-Pacific, Washington, D.C. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. Graham, for that first keynote speech and helping us contextualise what the Indo-Pacific is going to look like in the next 5 years. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker for this morning, Emeritus Professor Paul Dibb. Sir, would you like to address the audience?
I want to talk to you this morning about defence planning in an era of profound strategic disruption. Australia's international security outlook is starting to look very unpredictable and potentially threatening. Our defence planners must now deal with a world which is very different from any they have known before. America is undermining the international rules-based order, and at the same time, China and Russia are becoming increasingly assertive militarily and aligned in their anti-Western attitudes. All this is taking place as a crisis of democracy in the West is distracting it from wielding its national power more effectively. We are now in a period of unpredictable strategic transition in which the comfortable assumptions of the past are over. We need to encourage imaginative strategic thinking about Australia's future in a more dangerous world. In this speech, I shall talk about two strategic challenges. First, I will address why we are now in defence warning time, in my view, and the implications of this for mobilisation and the ADF's expansion base. Second, I'll explore with you my current research, which analyses the new geopolitical alignment between China and Russia and what that means for the security of the West, including Australia. First then, as to warning time and the ADF's expansion base. Australia's strategic outlook is deteriorating, and for the first time since the Second World War, we face an increased prospect of threat from high-level military capabilities being introduced into our region. This means that a major change in Australia's approach is needed to the management of strategic risk. Strategic risk is a grey area in which governments need to make critical assessments of capability, motive and intent. Since the 1976 Defence White Paper, judgments in this area have relied heavily on the conclusion that the capabilities required for a serious assault on Australia simply did not exist in our region. And I was marginally involved with the 76 White Paper, and as some of you know, I basically wrote the 87 White Paper. That was a different world. In contrast, in the years ahead, the level of capability able to be brought to bear against Australia will increase. So judgments relating to warning time will need to rely less on evidence of capability and more on assessments of motive and intent. Such areas for judgment are inherently ambiguous and uncertain. The potential warning time is now shorter because regional capability levels are higher and will increase yet further. This observation applies both to shorter-term contingencies and increasingly to more serious contingencies credible in the foreseeable future. So how should Australia respond? Contingencies that are credible in the shorter term could now be characterised by higher levels of intensity and technological sophistication. This means that readiness and sustainability need to be increased. We need higher training levels, a demonstrable and sustainable surge capacity, increased stocks of munitions, and especially missiles, more maintenance spares, a robust fuel supply system, which we don't currently have, and modernised and protected operational bases in the north of Australia. For the longer term, the key issue is whether there is a sound basis for the timely expansion of the ADF. Matters that would benefit from specific examination include the development of an Australian equivalent of an anti-access and area denial capability, especially for our vulnerable northern and western approaches. An improved capacity for anti-submarine warfare, and seriously revisiting our capacity for sustained strike operations. The prospect of shortened warning times now needs to be a major factor in our defence planning. Much more thought needs to be given to planning for the expansion of the ADF and its capacity to engage in high-intensity conflict in our own defence in a way that we haven't previously had to consider. Planning for the defence of Australia needs to take these new realities into account, including by re-examining ADF preparedness levels and lead times for key elements of the expansion base. We must now refocus on our own region of primary strategic interest, which includes the Eastern Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, including the South China Sea, and the South Pacific. The conduct of operations further afield, including in the Middle East and Afghanistan, and defence's involvement in counter-terrorism, must not be allowed to distract either from the effort that needs to go into this planning or from the funding that enhanced capabilities will require. This will demand a major change in Australia's approach to the management of strategic risk. To the extent that capability for offensive operations against Australia were developed by a foreign power, Australia would have to rely on the more judgmental indicators relating to motive and intent than on evidence of capability. This would be compounded by the likely absence of an obvious warning threshold. To help manage this ambiguity and uncertainty, it would be vital for Australia to continue to have high levels of intelligence collection and analysis. And I mean here forward-thinking analysis, not operational intelligence analysis. It needs to be acknowledged that recent strategic developments in our region also reflect a steady reduction in Australia's strategic space, which is being challenged. This is shortening the time that Australia has to understand, prepare, and if necessary, to respond to adverse military developments. The transformation of major power relations in the Asia-Pacific region is having a profound effect on our strategic circumstances. Without increases in our defence preparedness, the options available to the government for the ADF's involvement in contingencies that would be characterised by higher levels of intensity and technological sophistication would run the risk of being severely constrained. The issue for the longer term is whether we have built a sound basis from which to expand the ADF, especially our strike, air combat and maritime capabilities. Having such an expanded force would significantly increase the military planning challenges faced by any potential adversary and increase the size and military capabilities of the force. It would have to be prepared to commit to attackers directly or to coerce, intimidate, or otherwise employ military power against us. Attacks on Australia of an intensity and duration sufficient to be a serious threat to our national way of life would be possible only by an adversary's forces with access to bases and facilities in our immediate neighbourhood. This needs to be taken into account when considering the development of Australia's strike forces so that they have sufficient weight to deny any future adversaries such military bases. This involves reconsidering the range, endurance and weapon load of our strike forces and the numbers needed for repeated strike operations in the archipelago to our north. Any serious review of Australia's evolving strategic circumstances will come to the conclusion that warning time is becoming shorter and that the management of strategic risk is becoming significantly more demanding. Thus, it is imperative that planning for the defence of Australia and for operations in our region of primary strategic concern resumes the highest priority in our defence planning. Re-establishing our foreign policy and defence presence in this part of the world should also be our key priority. We need to get rid of the 2016 Defence White Paper's ill-advised proposition that the defence of Australia, a secure near region, and our global defence commitment should be, and I quote, 3 equally weighted defence objectives to guide the development of the future force, unquote. Finally, it needs to be recognised that the policy line that I am recommending is a continuation of Australia's long-standing defence policy that we do not identify any particular country as a threat. Rather, we are responding to the significant improvement in high-tech military capabilities across the board in our region. We would simply be adopting an area denial force posture like that of some other countries in our region. And I want to turn to my second subject, which is quite different, and that is the geopolitics of China's alignment with Russia. While we are in an era when the risks of major power conflict are growing, the most likely contenders are seen to be China, the rising power, and the US as the formerly dominant power that some argue is in decline. The other worrying contingency is conflict between Russia and NATO, led by the US. But what about the third possibility? The prospect of China and Russia collaborating to challenge American military power. Zbigniew Brzezinski warned that the most dangerous scenario for America would be a grand coalition of China and Russia united not by ideology, but by complementary grievances. China and Russia are the two leading revisionist powers, leagued together in their disdain for the West. Both these authoritarian states see a West that they believe is preoccupied with debilitating political challenges at home. Putin has disdain for what he sees as a Europe that is weak, divided, and bereft of morality. Xi Jinping believes that China is well on its way to becoming the dominant Asian power, possessing an alternative and successful model of political and economic development to that of the West. China and Russia have commonly perceived threats and are now sharing an increasingly close relationship, including militarily. If the China-Russia military partnership continues its present upward trend, it will inevitably affect the international security order, including by challenging the system of US-centered alliances in the Asia-Pacific and in Europe. This is not to argue that we are going to see a formal Russo-Chinese alliance, but what we are observing is an ever closer friendship of mutual alignment. Russia and China are economically complementary. They are both secure continental nuclear powers, and they are both the dominant military powers in their own immediate regions. In their different ways, they probably see that the West's current disarray favors them geopolitically. So what are the chances of Beijing and Moscow concluding that now is the time to challenge the West and to take advantage of what they both consider to be Western weaknesses? China and Russia are well aware of the impressive military power of the United States, but they both know that the US no longer enjoys uncontested or dominant military superiority everywhere. Recognizing this, it may be the time has come when Beijing and Moscow test America's mettle and see if they can successfully challenge the US in both the European and Asian theatres at the same time. China and Russia may come to the decision they could successfully regain lost territories in such places as Taiwan and Ukraine. Beijing and Moscow perceive both these places as central to their rightful historical and cultural claims as great powers. Russia and China are increasingly joining forces in the international arena to balance against America, and their militaries are becoming much closer. Recently, their partnership has deepened to provide for increasingly advanced Russian military equipment sales to China, including quiet conventional submarines, advanced air defense systems, and high-performance military jet engines. As well as joint military exercises in the Baltic, which China has taken part in, and in the East China Seas, which Russia has participated in, including the rendezvousing of Russian and Chinese destroyers in the Senkaku-Diaoyutai area. On the 23rd of July this year, Chinese and Russian nuclear-capable bombers rendezvoused in East Asia and carried out joint patrols. The Major General in charge of the new Chinese Defence White Paper specifically pointed that out to me on his visit to Canberra to release that White Paper just a couple of months ago. Given Russia's slow decline and China's rapid rise, we might have expected that Russia would support Western efforts to balance China rather than undermine them. But the evidence now is accumulating to suggest that Russia's relationship with China is deepening, especially militarily, and this carries distinctly negative geopolitical implications for the West. The distinguished American historian Walter Russell Mead has recently described current Russian and Chinese military activities as, and I quote, the latest manifestation of a deepening alliance between Russia and China, close quote. So what risks might China and Russia take to recover what both consider to be historical territories belonging to the motherland? It is important to understand that in China and Russia, we have two long-established cultures different from the Western tradition. They have deep-seated memories of humiliation at the hands of the West. Both Russia and China have experienced historical circumstances when their societies have been weak and where the West has taken advantage of them. And they reject what they see as Western interference in their domestic political systems. Both China and Russia have effectively used incremental territorial claims recently to their military advantage. China's creeping militarization of the South China Sea is now an established fact. Russia's use of military force in Crimea and Ukraine has been imposed without effective military challenges from the West. In both Beijing and Moscow, there is every reason why they should consider these as effective models to continue demonstrating their great power status. It now looks as though China and Russia are combining their forces to balance against the US, which they see as the common enemy. The fact is that Russia's relations with China are now much closer than ever before. China is strong and decisive enough to serve as a strategic partner, while Russia seeks to reassert itself as an independent great power in Europe. For its part, China is responding to its newly competitive confrontation with President Trump's America by deepening its strategic relationship with Russia. China has no other strong major power relationship either in Asia or Europe. Both China and Russia are now allied in a quest to refashion the world order that is safe for their respective authoritarian systems. Both leaders have reasons to be gratified by global trends, and they are outgaming the West. Beijing and Moscow believe they cannot afford to have poor relations with the other at a time of great strategic opportunity and with the Western alliance now in disarray. There can be little doubt that the build-up of their respective military forces suggests that they are both increasingly prepared for armed conflict with the West. The rapid development of China's military capability, together with serious reforms in Russia's military forces, is occurring at a time when America can only fight one major regional conflict and mount a holding operation in another regional conflict. Washington's national defense strategy acknowledges that the central challenge to US security is the re-emergence of long-term strategic competition with China and Russia. America aims to maintain favorable regional balances of power in both the Indo-Pacific and Europe, but that will be a particularly challenging task given China's rising power in Asia and Russia's flexing of its military muscles in Europe. So what are the implications of all this for the West? The fact is that the West is entering a period of great strategic disruption and instability. America's obsession with looking inward and making America great again opens fresh geopolitical possibilities for China and Russia. Implications for Australia not only relate to the dangers of armed conflict involving China and Russia against the West. Some of these conflicts might involve Australia more directly. Moreover, there is another important issue for Australia, and that is Russia's continuing supply of advanced weapons to China and their growing presence in our region. Which leads me to my final question. Is there nothing that can be done about the growing strategic alignment between China and Russia? The classical balance of power response to such a question would be to postulate an American attempt to detach Russia and cement its partnership with the US. In my view, however, nothing is likely to change the current adversarial nature of US-Russia relations. Brzezinski's warning that the most dangerous scenario facing US security would be a grand coalition of China and Russia is now becoming an established geopolitical fact. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dibb. So that completes the second of our keynote presentations that we've had this morning, and there's a lot of food for thought there, which should hopefully stimulate the minds for the question and answer session we'll have later on at 10 o'clock. For those of you that missed the introduction at the start and how to submit questions, you can either submit them via Twitter or via the Pacific 19 app. Just make sure you click on the interactive section of that page, such that your question goes to the moderators. Now that we've had those keynote presentations to help us contextualise what the Indo-Pacific look like over the next 5 years, That will now be backed up by a number of our esteemed panellists we have here, who are all experts in their respective fields, and we'll hear from them shortly. The first panellist I'd like to call forward is Professor Caitlin Byrne. Professor Byrne is the director of the Griffith Asia Institute. She's also a faculty fellow of the University of Southern California Centre for Public Diplomacy. Her research is focused on Australian diplomacy and has a special interest in Australia's engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. Professor Byrne, would you like to address the audience?
Are you happy for me to address from here? Is that okay?
No drama.
Great. Look, it's a real pleasure to be here today. And in starting, I'd particularly like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of this beautiful place that we're in, Sydney, and recognise that their connection to Sydney Harbour is a really significant reminder for us of the importance of our maritime resources, and just like to reflect on the words of Rear Admiral Muhammad Ali yesterday, who reminded us that the maritime spaces and resources are really a shared resource for humankind, and we have to think of it in that way. We've already had two fantastic keynotes, and I'd like to thank my colleagues, Euan and Paul, for doing such a brilliant job of setting the scene today. We've heard a great deal about the changes taking place, the emerging traditional and non-traditional threats, the era of strategic uncertainty and disruption that we're facing, not just for the next 5 years, but for the next decades. And one of the things that has really struck me about being here at this conference is how planning really does need to be far more long-term than often we consider. I've been struck thinking about the acquisition, sustainment and transformation of Australia's naval assets at the excellent planning that goes on within the Navy, and I congratulate you on that. So I feel a little bit silly in some ways thinking just about the next 5 years in the Indo-Pacific, and I think more of us, more frequently, have to think about the alternative futures of this region stretching well past that 5-year period. What I would like to do today, though, is focus in on one area that I think is of critical importance, and that is how we frame the rules-based order. First, to recognise that that rules-based order is under challenge. Second, that that challenge is a shared concern for those of us who consider ourselves part of the Indo-Pacific. And we need to not just respond to shifts, but be proactive in the way that we're thinking about the rules of our region and how and when they apply. And I think that requires leadership, not just the leadership of any one nation acting alone, but leadership through partnership, another theme that I've heard resonate through this room and other rooms over the past couple of days. And thirdly, I think within this strategic reordering that we are seeing underway at the moment, I'd like to suggest that there is a contest for narrative underway, and that the narrative of the Indo-Pacific, complemented by a narrative of the rules-based order that we would like to see in this region, is a necessary narrative for our leaders to take forward. But first to the rules-based order, which refers in a general sense to the body of rules, norms and institutions that regulate the behaviours and interactions of sovereign states and other actors in the global system. It's an order most visibly founded on the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions under the global stewardship of the United States and with multilateralism at its core. The grand aim of this rules-based order, of course, is worth remembering: to ensure to the greatest extent possible that all nations can share in the benefits of peace and prosperity. History matters here, and Robert Kagan is at pains to remind us that these grand aims were not born of any naive optimism, but instead from hard experience and pessimism of two catastrophic global wars, the Holocaust, man-made famines, the rise of fascism and communism, and the near death of liberalism and democracy in Europe and beyond. We must, of course, remember that the rules-based order today, in the established rules-based order, neatly encapsulates a transatlantic moment. And reference to this has gained political currency, particularly amongst Western political leaders over the past decade, with many advocating for its preservation and promotion, and quite rightly so, including nations like Australia. We've benefited from the underlying principles of freedom of navigation, open and fair trade, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Today, many of us locate this rules-based order at the heart of our strategic policy. But it's also worth remembering that this existing narrative of the rules-based order is not without contention. It is an order that reinforces established preferences, established powers, and established influences. And as such, it's not surprising that the rules-based order might also be seen by some as a euphemism for preserving the entrenched interests of the status quo. We need to recognise, though, that the rules-based order is under challenge on a number of fronts. Indeed, China has been cast as the primary challenger and has created significant uncertainty through its own rise about the kind of order we might see in the Indo-Pacific into the future. Again, not without cause. Persistent militarisation, grey zone tactics in the South China Sea, and the rejection of arbitration under UNCLOS go to the core of this issue. While Beijing argues claims of historic maritime usage, interpretation and jurisdiction, the clear intent of its message is that China's national interests will trump negotiated rules-based regional agreement and approaches, reinforced by an increasingly assertive, sometimes disruptive, and at times coercive diplomacy, and cast against the background of intense national ambition. Its message strikes a worrying tone. Yet it might also be argued that China is seeking to innovate the rules-based order. The establishment of the multilateral Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank is, according to the UN, reshaping the landscape of development finance and mobilising capital for much-needed infrastructure projects in the developing world. President Xi's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, offers a further example of innovation, again promoting infrastructure and connectivity projects in the region. Criticisms of the Belt and Road's opaque, debt-financed approach and characterisations that it represents a new form of colonialism, particularly in our region, have been damaging, but have also prompted revisions and improvements from China in its project delivery, a response that is consistent with the nature and process of innovation, imperfect though it may be. And yet on other matters, we do see China is contributing to maintaining the rules-based order through global governance, peacekeeping, disaster recovery, counter-terrorism, anti-piracy operations, global public health, and development assistance. All of those are notable. And China isn't the only challenger here. An increasingly insular and introspective United States, whose leader prefers deals to rules, appears intent from withdrawing from, or at least disrupting, the rules-based order it once championed. At the same time, an emerging multipolarity, particularly in our region, will see other powers, including Russia, openly challenge those rules. The signs of fragmentation are now conspicuously playing out in our region. Rules, of course, are not intended to be fixed. They will morph and they evolve as they are interpreted, tested, enforced, ignored, or overturned. Shifting dynamics in our current global landscape will generate more of this movement. Some of it is unanticipated. For example, increasing demand for resources, coupled with the impacts of a changing climate, whether we're talking about receding ice caps, rising sea levels, the changing patterns of mosquito-borne disease, the impact of extreme weather events, all of these will open up our existing sets of rules to new challenges. Additionally, the emergence of new frontiers, unregulated, from space to cyber, will create new forms of competition and demand the formulation of new rules, and they will require us to include other actors in that process. And of course, non-traditional and unpredictable transnational threats, including urban terrorism, as well as climate change, will intensify the pressure on our rules and the order that they seek to underpin. Responding to the challenges of changes within our rules-based order as a shared interest requires leadership. Much has been talked about here over the last couple of days about leadership, well, really about partnership. Whether we're talking about interagency partnerships, joint force partnerships, interoperability, regional coalition building, all of these forms need to be thought about through a leadership lens, and investing in our capacity to provide leadership through partnership is an important criteria going forward. But we also need to see a stronger narrative about what it is we're trying to achieve in this region. And I'd argue that there is a contest for narrative underway. Providing a narrative for a future regional order in which all players and powers, great, middle and small, might benefit is absolutely critical. As it currently stands, the established narrative of a rules-based order is insufficient. Imperfections arising from its outdated Western bias, its inconsistent application and visible impotence in the face of new challenges continues to undermine its appeal and credibility. Moves to reframe that narrative, to anchor it within an Indo-Pacific vision, may prove more successful. If I can just conclude then by saying the rules-based order is complex, it's imperfect, and it's an evolving institution in which we all have a stake. Securing its future demands a more coherent, contemporary, inclusive form of leadership and a narrative to guide it, underpinned by policy substance and reinforced by cooperative action. Notions of a free and open Indo-Pacific might just offer a strategic narrative that is a better fit for our time. The contest to influence that narrative is a test of leadership, and leadership matters more in times of crisis, strategic vulnerability and uncertainty than when the international conditions are stable. That time, I would suggest, is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Byrne. Our next speaker is Dr. Beck Strating, which some of you may have heard from her yesterday at the Senior Enlisted Leadership Conference. Dr. Strating is a lecturer of Politics and International Relations at the Department of Politics and Philosophy at La Trobe University. Her primary interest areas are Australian and Asian politics, and her current research is focused on contemporary maritime disputes in East Asia. Dr. Strating, I invite you to address the audience.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic to be here, and I thank Chief of Navy and the Sea Power Centre for inviting me to speak here today, as well as yesterday. And I think, Professor Byrne, your presentation has really provided some really great context for what I would like to say. I'm focusing my comments today on the continuing rising threat of populism and declining democracy in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Scholars of global democracy express serious concern about the retreat of democracy across the world. In 2018, the annual Freedom in the World report recorded the 13th consecutive year of decline in global freedom, spanning democratic countries such as the United States to consolidated authoritarian regimes like China and Russia. So, I think that the democratic retreat looks set to continue across the region, undoing some but not all of the gains of the so-called third wave of democracy that began in 1974. In a number of Australia's important partners in the Indo-Pacific, states like India, like the Philippines, Indonesia and Thailand, political scientists have extensively detailed rise in populist governance and declining quality of democracy to varying degrees. But consolidated or long-standing democracies such as Australia have not been immune from these global forces and trends when it comes to governance. For these states, challenges to democracy come from outside, and we have in this country heard a lot about foreign interference in our democracy and in elections, but they also come from within, as vital qualities of democracy, such as press freedom, are slowly eroded away. And it appears that these trends will make the region less conducive to individual freedom, to democratic governance, to human rights, to liberalism, to transparency and accountability, and more amenable to authoritarian and competitive authoritarian systems of rule. The liberal international order that Australia has sought to support as a centrepiece of its foreign policy appears increasingly in trouble, and that is true in the Indo-Pacific as well as much more globally. But what I find troubling is that it appears that populism and extreme far-right criticisms of global governance and mechanisms of global governance are now entering the discourse of Australian foreign policy. Last week, at a Lowy Institute event, Australia's Prime Minister argued that we should avoid any reflex towards a negative globalism that coercively seeks to impose a mandate from an ill-defined, borderless global community, and worse still, an unaccountable internationalist bureaucracy. What I find troubling about this is that it echoes some of the language of nationalism, of patriotism, of populism that has been evident in Trump's America. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this speech has been presented not long after Prime Minister Morrison has returned from his trip to the United States. But it seems that globalism is negative when it involves Australia being criticised for not conforming with international law. International law and global organisations like the United Nations are easy targets for populists, but a core part of Australia's long-standing middle power diplomacy is multilateralism. It's respect for global governance. It's the narrative of the rules-based order. It's about being a responsible stakeholder in the international system. International law matters when you are not a great power. International law can help non-great powers defend the interests of non-great powers from great powers. And that doesn't mean that we can opt in and out of the international legal systems when they are inconvenient to the political objectives of our governments. If we look at the maritime domain, Australia has the world's third largest EEZ, and yet it has 1/3 of 1% of the global population. These vast maritime entitlements, these vast maritime resources are bestowed upon Australia by an UNCLOS-led maritime order. And as Caitlin mentioned, after the People's Republic of China's rejection of the arbitral tribunal ruling in the South China Sea case against the Philippines in 2016, Australia amplified its rules-based order narrative as a response. It emphasised the need for China to abide by and respect the ruling of international courts and tribunals. But how can we tell rising powers to abide by the rules-based order if at times we appear reluctant to do so ourselves, if we are reluctant to fulfil some of our international obligations? Compliance starts at home. And I think that there is a bit of an issue with how we focus on Trump as a rules breaker, because actually the United States has a long history of exceptionalism, of trying to exempt itself from particular legal orders and conventions and treaties. This is not just about Trump. And in fact, previous governments, Democrat and Republican alike, have struggled to ratify UNCLOS, which is at the core of the maritime order. In some ways, I think about what's going on in the South China Sea, and I think this is exceptionalism with Chinese characteristics. So some of these narratives around sovereignty and this negative globalism, I think they undermine the narrative that we are trying to create around the rules-based order. And the regional trends, as we've heard, lean very much towards, not just towards strategic contestation, but normative contestation. There are disputes and debates about the rules, about who gets to make the rules, about how rising powers might be accommodated in the creation of new rules and norms and patterns of behaviour, and the extent to which rising powers might have some rights in reordering the region. But the fraying of the rules-based order will only continue if regional democracies, the so-called like-minded states, continue to make decisions and policies based on inwardly focused, short-term, domestic, political and populist factors. And I don't think that's just about the United States. I'm concerned that this is also happening in our own country. And sometimes when governments talk about protecting national interests, they're actually talking about protecting electoral interests, and there's a difference. It seems clear to me that one of the motivating factors for a more populist foreign policy language is the reputational hit that Australia has copped at global institutions, particularly over its policies relating to asylum seekers and climate change. Over the next 5 years, in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, climate change is going to present massive disruption and strategic challenges. Dealing effectively with climate change is a national interest, it is a strategic interest, it is a security interest. Sidestepping action on climate change may be an electoral interest, but even then, I anticipate that it's only a short-term one, as Australia begins to feel more fully the impacts of a changing climate. Not dealing effectively with climate change is harming Australia's international relations, particularly with Pacific Island states, who view climate change as an existential security threat. It's eroding our influence in that part of our region, and it's having a serious effect, negative effect, on our credibility as a responsible stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific. And at the same time, Australia's step-up policy demonstrates that it is concerned about debt trap diplomacy and the prospect of Chinese military bases springing up in its strategic backyard. So more than ever, we need a coherent and long-term foreign policy that looks beyond electoral cycles and base political party priorities to deal much more effectively with the challenges that we have heard about from this panel that face the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Strating. I'd like to invite our next speaker, Associate Professor Stephan Frühling. Stephan Frühling is a Senior Lecturer in the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU. His primary areas of research and publication include Australian strategic and defence policy, ballistic missile defence and nuclear weapons, as well as strategic policy. Dr. Frühling, I invite you to address the audience.
All right, thank you. Now, we're asked to look about 5 years out on strategic developments in the Indo-Pacific, and I'll focus in my remarks on what I think Australia's strategic policy could and should develop over that time and what this might mean for Navy. I listened with particular interest to the presentations on Tuesday by the Minister, the Chief of Navy, and his fellow chiefs, and it's interesting to reflect on how much the debate has changed to that of even just 3 or 4 years ago, before the 2016 White Paper. The notion that a program of continuous shipbuilding is the basis of Australia's ability to develop and grow our maritime power for the Indo-Pacific in this new century has become almost uncontested within those few short years. And the focus on Indo-Pacific partnerships as a key element of our strategic policy and a key focus for Navy's operational forward presence is also something that has actually only developed over those few years and does give some strong support to the notion that defense really is slowly becoming a strategy-led organization. In general, because of the nature of what navies do, it's almost inevitable that they respond most visibly and directly to such changes in strategic policy compared to the other services. Army and Air Force can change from training against Camarians and Musarians and back, but nobody outside those services, and most people even within those services, will never really notice because it all happens on the same ranges and in the same foxholes. But I think navies are different because once you leave port, the question of where do you now go kind of is almost inevitable. And so it's not surprising that developing Indo-Pacific partnerships is something that has become so central to what the Navy does today. Moreover, it's also so that naval platforms tend to most visibly change, admittedly with some lag, to changes in national strategy. And if you go back to the recent decades, if, for example, debates about US maritime strategy were often even expressed in the 1980s as debates between the 500 and the 600 ship Navy. In the 1990s, you had an almost totemic kind of focus on the number of the carrier battle groups in US defense strategy. and the littoral combat ship will probably always be associated in the most kind of like enduring legacy of Donald Rumsfeld's ideas of transformation. And even in Australia, if you look at the debate, the decision not to replace the carrier and the definition of the original Anzac frigate capability for Southeast Asian contingencies and not Northern Hemisphere ones, have little impact in the other services in the way that strategic policy judgments had a direct impact on capability. The problem, though, is I think if we look at the Indo-Pacific over the next 5 years, what is that Australian strategy today that the Navy should be supporting and should be developed for? This is really one of the key questions that Defence will need to confront in the current review that the Minister announced on Tuesday, because the answer really isn't in the 2016 White Paper. Back in the olden days of the 1950s and the 60s, Australia conceived not of one, but of three related strategies. And in many ways, strategic policy was how do you balance the demands and prioritize between the three. And those were strategies for the Cold War, which we might call strategies for competition, for limited war, and for global war. Partnerships are important in all three regards, but the forces and posture that these three strategies require and the demands that they place on different elements of the Navy, the ADF as a whole, and its national support infrastructure, and the Australian alliances are quite different. Ultimately, to govern means to choose. And Australian governments in the past have prioritized capabilities for Cold War operations or for limited operations at changing times. And we're not alone in the need to choose. If you go back to the discussions on Tuesday, Admiral Aquilino, for example, spoke of the need to strike a balance between preparing to fight and win and operating forward to deter. And Admiral Prazouk also spoke of the need to constantly evaluate the balance between presence and intervention, between heavy and light forces. But how do we do so, and what our priorities should be in these trade-offs is a question that our strategic policy really still has to come to terms with. I hope that Defence and government will start to answer some of these questions in the review, but even if they do, it's unlikely that they will be directly reflected in public announcements of that new defence update. So if we look forward 5 years to Sea Power 2024, what might we kind of like see in the discussions to show that we have started to come to terms with these kind of questions? And what are the questions that I hope our Sea Power 2024 will engage with to support that analysis and understanding what that means for defense and for the Navy in particular? Well, the first question is, or the first issue is the greater understanding and discussion of the trade-offs that we will need to make as we set those priorities between competition, limited, and global war. That means that I think we need a much greater understanding at the defense, at the industry, and the political level of how the national shipbuilding system and the RAND's growing role as a parent navy enable us to adjust our force structure more rapidly than might otherwise be the case to the strategic needs that Paul, for example, just spoke about. Combined with a clearer articulation and discussion of the different roles and that different parts of the Navy might play in different situations. If we prioritize capabilities for global rather than limited war, for example, how can we use the shipbuilding enterprise for battle damage repair? And what parts of it in our wider naval shore infrastructure do we need to defend against cruise missile and other attack? If you slap a towed array onto an OPV and use it as a helicopter lily pad, you may well have an ASW platform that would be sufficient to defend rerouted Indian Ocean and Pacific slogs that we might need to resupply ourselves with essential war stocks and fuel during global war. But could those OPV actually train that to sufficient proficiency if they're busy surveying South Pacific EEZs? So flexibility and multi-role are all fine and good, but in the end, they still impose costs and trade-offs are inevitable. So one question we might ask is, how might we make use of industry, capacity building, and shore-based activities to even further step up our partnerships in the maritime domain if we were to spend more days at sea honing Navy for high-end warfighting, or there's simply not enough ships around to achieve the partnership outcomes in the way that we do today. A second question that I think we need to start engaging with in much greater detail in this context is the strategic role of forward presence in general and the strategic role of Navy's forward presence in particular. Partnerships can help build capacity for a small force, as the Vice Chief said on Tuesday, but that just begs the question of capacity for what? Where can we use partnerships to help regional countries fulfill their own security objectives in the maritime domain? That may help us be successful in strategic competition with outside powers. But if we look to limited war, how would we use partnerships to signal political commitment, to deter and to reassure, when we've never really thought about our forward presence in those terms? Let alone how might we need to operate forward operationally and in a pole mill sense as we transition from competition to crisis, to conflict, and to war. If you look at the European context, for example, NATO allies have standing naval forces that can be used for this political military signaling in a crisis. But there's nothing really that we've ever developed akin to this in the Indo-Pacific. This is not to say that we need a standing arrangement or that this necessarily has to be an alliance construct, but nor can we expect to make absolutions to successful political military challenges of signaling in a crisis as we go along. On the other hand, Euan Graham's discussion of the new Marine Corps guidance yesterday highlighted that forward presence for actual operations in global conflict might look very different again from what we might maintain in steady-state competition or in limited conflict. And in global war, if we decide that the strategic purpose of our forward presence is to reassure our regional partners that we have their back, and that's not necessarily inevitable, but may well be the case, does that mean that we have to be comfortable with that strategic presence staying there throughout a crisis and into conflict and perhaps not coming back? So in the discussions on Sea Power 2024, if the discussions at Sea Power 2024 will reflect engagement with these kinds of trade-offs and the strategy and the strategic logic of why we actually have Navy forward deploying in competition, crisis, and conflict, just in the same way that these year's discussions have responded to the 2016 White Paper direction, then I think Navy, Defence, and Australia as a whole will be well on our way to manage the challenges that the region is throwing at us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Frühling. Our next speaker is Dr. Andrew Carr. Dr. Carr is a senior lecturer in the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU. His research focus is mainly on strategy, middle powers and Australian defence policy. And Dr. Carr, I invite you to address the audience.
Well, good morning. If you don't mind, I might stand to help the blood go as we get towards the coffee break. And can I begin by thanking the organisers for the invitation to speak here. It's been an outstanding conference, and can I also pay my respect to the local people on whose land we meet. My short talk today tries to link some of the themes that we've heard here. In our writing instructions for this session, we were asked to think about the Indo-Pacific over the next 5 years. And it's often the way, particularly at Australian forums like this, that we tend to look out. We are a coast dweller people. Very appropriate that we are here discussing maritime issues. But I'd like to start by turning inwards a little bit and looking at how I see Australia changing over the next 5 years. If there is one phrase that has defined Australian foreign policy and strategic policy in the 20th century, it was the notion that peace is indivisible. It is this logic that has led us from commitments to the Boer War to the Gulf War, our unbroken commitment and deployment of forces to the Middle East since 1948. But that was the 20th century, in that it led to ideas such as good international citizenship, and we described ourselves as a global middle power. We thought about the global balance. We thought about global threats. We acted to address global concerns. I would argue that Australia is no longer a middle power. We are changing to become a regional power. And that is why I think the term Indo-Pacific is so important. Not because it signifies our interest in India or our belief that somehow this vast sweep of the world is a single strategic system, and I would push back on that idea, but rather that we have defined the Indo-Pacific as an outer definition and a division of our understanding of what matters in the world and where we are going to seek to contribute. That is that no longer are we thinking in purely global terms, although we may make the occasional transactional contribution, but that we have now begun to divide the world. Peace is divisible, and we are much more concerned about specific areas and actions in specific places. Within that Indo-Pacific, I would say there is actually a second division at work. There is the outer ring of the broad Indo-Pacific, thinking about political, economic, social interactions. It's a zone where cooperation is a must with other states, where our political leaders are still quite optimistic in many ways. If you read the front half of the Defence White Paper and their speeches about regional trends. It is a zone where our political leaders are much more comfortable talking about in public. But there's another ring. That is the inner ring. This is the zone that we're actually devoting our spending. This is the zone of Southeast Asia, particularly the maritime elements, the South Pacific, and the continent. And my reading of the changes in Australia is that we are becoming increasingly pessimistic about the security of this inner ring, that we are devoting most of our capability and thinking towards it, and that this is the zone where, alone if necessary, we will need to think about the use of force to protect our interests. So we are starting to very clearly divide up the world from our 20th century global focus to a much more regional power approach and that inner and outer ring. And part of the fundamental reason that we are doing so and the fundamental challenge that we are facing in doing so is the need to link our changes in interests with the declining resource base relative to other states in our region. For most of the 20th century, we were able to be a global power despite our small size, able to engage in that strategic wandering because someone else was paying the bill. Our partners and allies were sustaining our presence and our security. That is no longer going to be the case, and it is that relationship between interests and resources that is our defining challenge and defining driver of the shift towards becoming a regional power. Now, thankfully, as a regional power, Australia is actually very well placed. In the current competition between the United States and China, I would argue that it is actually the steadfast states, such as Australia, that at its current phase, at least, that stand the most to gain. A lot of the 20th century Cold War competition was about the liminal states, those states that were on the border of the USA and USSR camps and might shift around. Think your Indonesia or Egypt. At the moment in the current competition, I would argue it's more of the steadfast states that are of greatest value. Australia has not only steadfast loyalty and relationships with the United States, but our geography is increasingly important. Now, the flip side of this increasing importance to the United States is that its administration, both at the executive, congressional, and official and bureaucratic levels, is increasingly distracted, not only by its global deployments, its declining resource base, debt issues, but certainly the political circus that we are seeing now engulfing Washington. Now, whether we see a change of president through the impeachment process, the next elections, the United States is unlikely to be able to pay the attention to Australia that it would like. And so I think this is actually a moment of opportunity. As we did in the 1940s, as we did in the 1980s, and it's fantastic we have Professor Paul Dibb here with us today to help illuminate, Australia should think about this moment as a chance to seize the initiative in our relationship with the United States, to define the relationship in a way that suits our interests as well as those of the United States, and to carve out the kind of role that we want to play and seek for the United States to respond to that. So changing the way that we think about that, using this moment of significance and leverage to our advantage to shape the kinds of forward thinking and opportunities and creations we are playing through. And the final thing I wanted to speak to you today about, and this draws on very usefully from Dr. Strating's fascinating discussions about the rise of populism and the concern there. And this has certainly been a theme. You'll all be very aware of the growing concerns about this, what Michael Howard used to call one of the forgotten dimensions of strategy, and that is the societal, the public, the role of public perceptions, attitudes, and narratives in shaping strategic competitions. The public or societal dimension has always been a part of strategy. You think of the Peloponnesian War and the Athenians electing to go behind their walls in the face of the Spartan challenge. You think of Sherman in the US Civil War burning his way through the South to demonstrate and bring the war home. Clausewitz, very much a time when the public was kept at large from competition and conflict, and yet still talked about the public as one of his key trinity, the passions of the people shaping it. So though the influence waxes and wanes, the societal dimension has always been a part of strategy and arguably has returned to a very significant role in recent years. There are, however, I would suggest, two elements of the discussion about the societal role in the conventional wisdom that should be challenged. First, it is often discussed as simply that the West is encumbered by politics, by domestic politics, by its open political system. And I would think this is a mistake. I would argue that the societal dimension works both ways. Too often we ignore, despite the warnings and concerns of area specialists, the way that domestic politics influences the way authoritarian and our adversary states think about their place in the world, act in the world, and the types of actions they undertake. It is not that the West has to deal with politics and somehow the authoritarians have objective, strategic kind of freedom to move about, but often their actions are very much driven by their own domestic political considerations. And I think that is something that we need to consider much more here in the West as an opportunity, but also as a means to understand how and why they are acting in the way they are. And secondly, when it comes to the West being encumbered by politics, I actually think this is to our great advantage. It is not a coincidence, it is not chance, it is not luck, as much as those were important, that the West won out in the 20th century. As Clausewitz argues, it is every conflict and war is a race to be first to understand the nature of the conflict you are in. Open democratic debate brings those discussions to the fore, as ugly and messy as it can be, as troubling and worrisome as we sometimes see it in terms of, say, the influence campaigns in the United States or in Australia, the heavyment of our companies and corporations. Bringing this to the fore and bringing the public alongside us is fundamental to our long-term security. So in discussions and conferences like this, as vital as they are, we need to not just talk about the public, we must think about how we can engage, educate, and bring in the public for these kinds of discussions. As Professor Dibb talked about, it is questions such as the mobilisation and expansion of the ADF that are occupying key planet minds at the moment, and those are fundamentally based on our public base and the resources that they can help support and provide to us. And these are going to be the key challenges we will need to think through. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Carr. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard over the previous 60 minutes or so has effectively been a masterclass in defence policy, strategic policy, regional engagement challenges and all sorts of different things. There should be enough food for thought there for you to generate questions for the Q&A period. But just before we get there, we're going to have a short panel discussion led by the Chair, and I'll hand over to you, Admiral Shackleton, to run that for the next 10 minutes or so.
Thank you. May I offer my own thanks for what you've presented today, everything from good to bad. Could I ask perhaps if we could just try and summarise for this audience, particularly who are all in white suits, what's the implications of what we've just been talking about for Australia's Navy? And within that, can you make any prognostications or suggestions, because it is always a conversation in the Navy and for those who pay for a Navy And navies are expensive things to own. And if you want to own something really expensive, go and buy yourself some submarines. What sort of force structure implications do you think flow from the notions that you think how Australia's Navy will be used and utilised, if not in the next 5 years, but might have to plan for the longer period, as some of you have suggested? Paul, can I start with yourself?
Really easy question, Admiral. I think in terms of what Andrew finished up talking about, we need to engage the Australian people more, and I don't detect in our politicians, including the speech that the Minister made to this conference during the week, any attempt to fundamentally look at, are we in a potentially threatening situation, and what are we going to do about it, or are we going to just simply extrapolate and she'll be right, mate? And that is a risk. I think in terms of your specific question, David, I'm in favour of a naval concept of sea denial. We can debate sea control, sea denial, but refocusing on our own region of primary strategic concern. Many decades ago, I defined Southeast Asia, South China Sea, South Pacific out to beyond Fiji, Antarctic waters, and now you would include the Eastern Indian Ocean, certainly at least out to Cocos Keeling Islands. You're looking at about 20-odd% of the Earth's surface. That is a non-trivial task for a Navy and indeed a defence force of our size. Secondly, and very briefly, if I was the CDF, which I'm not, I would be very positive about the $295 billion forward 10-year plus spend, and not least on Navy. My concern would be as CDF, what is my strike capability? Including, and David knows I'm not a technical expert, including on our submarines and warships. I'll be careful what I say, but we all know that if we had to do combat air patrol 24/7 or forward deploy 3, maybe 4 submarines on a continuing basis, we're going to have some problems. And what about such classified things as war stocks of missiles? I think the final issue I would raise, colleagues will have much more interesting views, is we need to get recognition in this country that some of my colleagues at the ANU are undermining, and that is the view that America has lost, China has won, and we will inevitably get out of the American alliance, and don't you worry about that, we will get most of our weapons from Europe, or, says this particular person, Russia. Oh, really? I'm not saying there aren't some good submarines and other things coming out of Europe, but let me make it extremely clear, and governments need to make it much more clear. Without American combat systems, weapons like the ADCAP-48, Joint Strike Fighters and Growlers, we would not have a credible defence force. We wouldn't have a 5th-generation Air Force, the only one in the region, or a 5th-generation Navy, which we're aiming for. And I'm getting rather tired of these discussions that let's pull out of the American relationship.
Thank you. I do want to leave time for members of the audience to bring questions to bear, because I think they've got some really interesting ones to come. Can I ask others if they may have some remarks they might like to make about what are the implications for the Navy and potentially force structure implications? Caitlin?
Just a quick remark, I guess. I think we need to think more carefully and in a more sophisticated way about the nature of the rules-based order that we are committing to, and really understand that. Alignments, yesterday David Brewster talked about the increasing geometries of alignment and alliances in this region. I think that's an important part of the way we're thinking about relationships. But I think the key point for me is that just as we talk about our investment in the acquisition, sustainment and transformation of big assets, we need to invest in, over the long term, the leaders that reside in our forces and including the leadership across forces and working with leaders right across the region. I think this is really important. I know manpower is an issue. Making sure we have effective leadership across the forces is critical.
Perhaps, Beck, I can close with you before we turn to the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to make the point, the maritime domain is obviously a theatre for strategic competition and norm contestation. And often we think about UNCLOS as being, the constitution of the oceans, and that's what's being contested. But I think that the Navy plays a crucial role, the Royal Australian Navy plays a crucial role in upholding and defending other sorts of rules that we might not always think about in terms of the rules of the road. I spent 5 days on HMAS Canberra earlier this year, and the midshipmen were getting ready they had an exam on the coal regs, and they had to learn the coal regs verbatim. And it struck me at this time that every time the Navy goes out to sea, it is upholding the rules-based order. Good order at sea is crucial. It's crucial for maritime safety, and maritime safety is crucial for maritime security. So I just wanted to kind of reflect on that, because that's something that, if academics don't get to go on ships, we don't always recognise that that's what's happening at a day-to-day quotidian level.
I'm sure the Chief of Navy will be happy to take anybody for a ride just to prove that he's getting value for money. Thank you. Jonathan, should we go to questions now?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the Q&A session's now open. Ready for our first question. So this is a question for the panel, so anyone may answer. With issues being faced by Australia clearly and universally expressed by the panel, what action needs to be taken immediately to deal with these issues?
Euan, would you like to take this?
Maybe. Okay, but I'll go back to the previous question, because I think it does, it answers both. If there is an issue, as Paul has identified, about needing to look at expanding the ADF expansion base, and if there is a clear foreshortening of warning times, one way to square the circle and get more from the same is to put more emphasis into unmanned systems. I think a lot of the debate is very focused on platforms. I think we're overly focused on platforms with the submarine, but in particular, but not exclusively. And I think that's one area where immediate effort has to be put. Bearing in mind that unmanned doesn't mean that there aren't personnel attached to that, but that I think would have to be factored also into the training cycle as well.
Stephan, do you want to add to that?
Well, as I said, I think to some extent the defence update is a welcome development in defence needing to articulate what actually are the force structure consequences going forward from the decisions in the 2016 white paper. In many ways, the 2016 white paper, in my view, decided that Australia should focus on the Indo-Pacific as its main area of focus, which was an important decision. It decided that the main focus of the ADF should be high-end warfare, state-on-state warfare, which was also not uncontested at the time, and I guess it funded some of the enablers. But beyond that, that's where it ended. So in many ways, the next set of questions, as I outlined, really need to be addressed now, because they will have implications for the capabilities that are coming online now. I do think that one of the things that we need to really get our head around are the questions of what would it mean to defend Australia in global war. I don't think global war is around the corner, but I think over the next 5 years it's something where we will need to start putting systems and concepts and capabilities in place. And I think that, again, it goes back to this question of what are we trying to achieve with the ADF in our own region to defend Australia. I think if you look at the role of Australia or the role of the ADF in global war, there's really two. One is to defend Australia as a base of long-range US operations, and we're going to be pretty busy doing that. The second one, though, is that we will still have independent interest in the need for independent operations in our own region, because in the end, the way that a post-war settlement arranges itself in our own immediate region will matter to us a lot more than it does to the Americans. And so I think that notion of independent operations has an applicability in limited war, but also in global war. And how do we kind of like reflect that in force structure is something that we need to start thinking about before we can then really decide on capability priorities. And I think that discussion is only really starting, if at all.
Thanks, Dr. Frühling. Next question for the panel. How should modern navies best prepare for asymmetric and disruptive technologies in this modern iteration of a naval arms race?
Andrew, I'm looking at you.
Look, this is, I think, a crucial question, and it comes back to, in particular, the idea and issue of speed. Western militaries, really since the 1970s onwards, have been able to prioritise speed, have seen it as an operational and tactical advantage, and even to some degree we've kind of allowed it to come up to the highest strategic level. I think in the future what we're seeing with these kind of asymmetric, disruptive technology, particularly unmanned systems, is that the speed at which they operate, the speed at which they are able to have an effect, is going to be so overwhelming that we're going to need to rethink our prioritization of speed. In fact, we're going to have to look for ways to actually slow down and obtain thinking time for both strategic leaders as well as at the operational and tactical level in order to enable us to operate more effectively. That's going to mean some delegation of responsibility about how to actually operate in certain scenarios and environments, and placing greater trust in our leaders, having a greater focus on the purpose for which we are showing presence or operating, rather than hoping to and kind of anticipating kinds of environments and situations and thinking those through and tying it much more closely to our interests, particularly in environments like the South China Sea. What exactly are we willing to use force for or against, and having that very clearly understood as we operate and go forward. And particularly also thinking about ways that some of the efforts by authoritarian states, such as the political influence campaigns, as A2AD technologies, are actually ways to slow down the way that we might attack these states, the way that they might defend themselves. They're actually using A2AD systems, I'd argue, to kind of slow down and reduce the speed at which the West can use its advantage. And I think we will need to think in similar terms for our own security. How might a country like Australia, even if we can't hold off a great power adversary or kind of keep ourselves entirely out of a conflict, but buy the time that we might need in order to mobilise the population, expand the ADF, or at least just get a better handle on the type of conflict in which we're operating. So buying time, slowing down and thinking about that role of speed, I think is going to be very crucial, particularly in the maritime domain.
Thank you. Euan?
A couple of quick thoughts. One, and this is on the back of Stephan's suggestion about maybe repurposing the new OPVs in an ASW role. I think that speaks to a principle about dual purposing what's available. The big challenge, I think, for the ADF is not the level of capability, it's the capacity. So I think thinking creatively about how to multi-purpose the existing assets that are there is important as a principle. As another principle, I think not over-designing future vessels, given that we can't anticipate the way that technology will develop. Those technologies are not just disruptive, they're also empowering. So building slack, I think, into future designs so that we're able not to have to then unpick the design, but particularly with surface vessels, but submarines where the emphasis is so much on space, making sure that principle of modularity can be built in as far as possible.
And just one more thought on that. I think learning from each other is a really important part of this process as well. And I know there are conversations across navies in the region, but this is where those mini-lateral groups working with like-minded, sharing experiences comes into play and can be a really effective part of building the partnership across the region.
Okay, next question. This is a long one, and bear with me. For the panel, historically in Australian political discourse, maritime forces were argued to have primacy as Australia's chief defence capability. In your opinion, why is there a dissonance in Australian strategic thinking and action?
This sounds like an inter-service rivalry question to me. Paul, would you like to kick it off, please?
Thanks. Thanks, Admiral. I don't want to go back into ancient history, but when the Minister said correctly earlier this week that there's been a lack of trust and connection between politicians and senior defence leadership, she was, of course, correct in the past. When I was commissioned by the then Defence Minister, Kim Beazley, to take a fundamental review of Australia's defence capabilities, we had a situation, and some of you may not know this, but it's central to answering this question, where the Chief of the Defence Force and his deputies and the Secretary of Defence and his deputies had spent a year looking at whether they could come up with some agreement about a set of force structure priorities for the defence of Australia. And all they did was exchange some of the most insulting memorandums I've ever read in my life. They were highly classified and they should have been burnt. We must never go down that path again. And what I see with you people in the Defence Force is, of course, there'll be, as the Admiral has said, inter-service rivalries, but now it's on a basis that is much more cooperative. Two final things. As I've said earlier, the biggest dissonance actually is between the Australian public, including businessmen and women, on the subject of China and those of us in the strategic community. And there's, how are we going to get the Australian people to accept that concepts like we're now in defence warning time, we need to really expand the ADF expansion base, and in the short term build up missile stocks and all that. That is a central issue. It is obvious when you look at our geography that maritime capabilities, by which I include Air Force and Air Strike, should always be central. I don't want to get into the argument about the role of the Army. It's been traditionally the dominant role right from the Boer War through First and Second World Wars, Vietnam, Afghanistan and so on. We now need to get the Army to refocus, and I presume that is happening.
I don't want to pursue that further, but I think it is fair to say that you've seen over the years a greater understanding the fact that we are an island continent, and therefore what runs up against our shores is important. Anywhere from Australia is pretty well a long way, so all three services have to cooperate with each other. It's as fundamental as that. Jonathan, I think this is an interesting question.
No worries, sir. This is the last question we'll have before I hand over to the Admiral for closing remarks, and well suited to this panel. For the panel, what can academia do better to increase the public discourse to a level that reflects the difficult debates and decisions that may have to be made by Australia in the near future?
Stephan, can we start at your end and perhaps roll through to myself? Thank you.
Ooh, that's a difficult one, yeah. Look, I guess, well, first of all, the question is, is it academia's responsibility? I think ultimately it's in the end, I think it's a political responsibility. I think national discourse responds to political discourse. I think academia can support that, and I think we should be, in many ways, we shouldn't be too harsh on ourselves. If you look at Australia, which is a country of, with a population halfway between kind of like the Dutch and the Spanish, I guess, if you look around the world, you will struggle to find other countries that have as kind of like developed public discourse on defense. And I just came back from several weeks in NATO Europe, and there's actually quite a lot of admiration for the way that the depth of public debate in most of those countries and in Australia that we have here on defense policy, you just don't see that in many other countries. You don't see defense supplements in newspapers or so in any other, almost any other Western country. So I'm not sure that we should be too harsh on ourselves. It doesn't mean that we can't do better, but to some extent, I think it's up to national political leadership in particular to carry that discourse. And if that doesn't happen, then you will not get the support for spending what we'll have to spend. And that's something that politicians need to make a case for and defend. It's not something that academia can do.
Stephan, thank you. Caitlin?
I see it slightly differently. I think we do have a role to play here, and bringing our research out of our offices and out of our heads and engaging much more widely. For me, for example, this conference has been enormously useful in just understanding some of the issues that are facing Navy at the moment. And that helps to inform me in the way that I think about our engagements with the public. The second thing is getting out of the capital. And this is no disrespect intended to colleagues who are based in the capital, who are really well placed to be at the centre of much of this debate. But I think we've really got to be having these conversations not just in Melbourne, Sydney, but Brisbane, Longreach, for example, Darwin. We should really be thinking much more broadly across this country about the kinds of conversations we're having. As a research institute, we also do a lot of engagement work, and I'd be very happy to be working with Defence Force as well about how we might curate and deliver conversations with public audiences, particularly across Queensland. There is an issue here, though, because those conversations are unpredictable, and we have to be ready to debate and ready to really engage in understanding where mainstream Australia is, what they're thinking, and potentially the gaps in their knowledge and understanding about what our defence forces are facing over the next 5 to 50 years.
Thanks, Caitlin. Euan.
Very briefly on the previous dissonance question, I think one key thing is that Australia has never fought alone. On the academia function, I have to reference, Beck and I were both lucky enough to be ship riders on the Indo-Pacific Endeavour deployment on HMAS Canberra. That certainly helps. It's a very good example, I think, where government can help us in understanding more about how you operate and work, and then take that out in a way that you're not able to. We have to use our ability to say what we want. I think the power of free speech is something that academia has that officialdom doesn't. And officialdom in Australia, I think, is particularly hidebound, not coming out in being able to say that in public. But in that vacuum, academia, it really does have a role here in a way that I think in other Western countries is maybe less the case. That's empowering for people like ourselves. I absolutely agree with what Caitlin said about not restricting this to the Canberra Beltway. There is a dissonance between the metropolises in Sydney and Melbourne and their understanding of defence issues. If you could send more people down to Melbourne, I'd personally be grateful.
Oh, I thought you meant the Canberra bubble. Thank you. Beck, did you have any?
Yeah, I want to support what Caitlin and Euan have just said about the differences between, the sort of metropolitan and rural regions. I'm a country girl myself, and sometimes when I hear some of the rhetoric that comes out of universities, I just go, is this really connecting with people? And, we really could do better at translating our research for public audiences. In an area like strategic studies, for example, I'm a politics person. That's my background. I read some stuff in strategic studies and I can find it really difficult to understand the jargon and the language. And I'm sure that people who aren't trained in politics will look at my discipline and see the same thing. So I think we do have a responsibility to contribute to the public discourse, but it's not just academia. There are other actors as well who are responsible for raising the attention on foreign and defence policy planning, I think that there is still work to be done.
Thank you. Andrew?
Look, for the last 40 years, Australia's had a bipartisan compact on how we think about our place in the world and our security, and I actually think that is starting to break down and needs to break down. There are great risks to partisan debate, but partisan debate is how we get our politicians interested in issues, how they devote resources and attention to it, and how they begin to then educate the public. And if there's a role for academics, it's not that whenever a politician comes out and says something that is vaguely stupid on international security, that we jump on their back and say, oh, you need to be bipartisan and support the troops. But we actually kind of give them that space to engage, to put up different ideas, and to encourage that debate to come through. I've actually got a larger report on this, borrowing from Monty Python. It's titled, I'm Here for an Argument. And it's not just an argument that we need to hear more from our politicians on the issues, but I would also argue we need to hear much more from the people in white and green and blue in this audience. That is, through places like the Forge, the Cove and other sources, we need more military voices in the public space. There's concerns about that, obviously, but I think it's vital that we start to hear from you as well to help guide what we think and the public can engage on these issues.
Thank you. Paul?
3 quick points. There is a burning need in this unstable strategic era for strategic imagination. You heard me raise that. We need to do better at encouraging people, both in the armed forces and in the public service, about stretching our minds and imagination. Defence is typically a very bureaucratic, slow-moving, negative organisation, in my experience. It isn't the lack of people with the right training, like yourselves, people who go to the War College and so on. It is certainly in the civilian area what I've seen in the past, and I've said this to Greg Moriarty, very bright young men and women, and particularly women now, are coming into the strategic policy area and they get crushed by the system. And the system is really good at crushing people. In terms of getting things published, Andrew does an extremely good job with the Strategic Defence Studies Centre of Gravity papers. The paper I've almost finished of about 11,000 words on, what happens when China and Russia go to war with the West. ASP is going to publish that by the end of the year. These are issues in Australia of getting your things published that don't fit nicely. Secondly, we need more policy-relevant research out of academia, not to dominate academic research, but in the ANU's strategic plan, policy-relevant research is a significant priority, as it is for our research school. I have to say, however, there are some of my academic colleagues that will actually say they're not interested in policy-relevant research. They look upon it as something not quite proper. Well, that's their decision. My view is we need to do better at it. And as the third point that is related to that, I want to see more of my academic colleagues, including people like Stephan Frühling and Andrew Carr here, actually experience a policy job in the defence organisation or elsewhere in the bureaucracy. It is a very different life from academia. Time is short, the pressure is on you. Certainly at my level as Deputy Secretary, it was eternal meetings that were bad-tempered, and the issue of managing money on scales that most academics have no experience of. I mean, it's a long time since I was in defence. As Deputy Secretary, I looked at nothing under $20 million, and we got a cabinet submission up through the Hawke-Keating government for the over-the-horizon radar for $1.2 billion. Those are figures that most academics have no real experience of. So more academics doing a period, doesn't have to break their careers, they can always come back into academia.
Paul, thank you. And I'm not going to summarise this conference because we're into time on, and I know we're between you guys and the heads or a coffee shop break or whatever you prefer to have. But I would like to say that if you wanted to distill it down to a few short words, it would be we are in a period of change and transition, and potentially profound change and transition. And that's what navies exist for, to help manage that transition. So if you thought it was all sweetness and light, I hope today has kind of dissuaded you from that. But there's always hope, but hope is not the answer. Can I please ask you to thank, first of all, Jonathan for being our MC today and making sure that we all did as we were told. And the panel for bringing their brains, hearts and minds to share with you what they have clearly put a lot of thought into, so it's for your benefit. Thank you.